So in turn, I'd like to say thank you to everybody at Visual AIDS and everybody who's kind of been a part of putting this project together, because it has been a huge group effort from loads of people. So and it's been amazing to get to work with some real legends, actually. But just to kind of say a bit about the exhibition. So kind of a tagline is that the exhibition explores how artists and activists have used comics to create and shape conversations around HIV and AIDS. So for me, it's been a way to explore how comics can and have been utilised as a mirror for contemporary culture. The exhibition collects both historical and contemporary examples of educational material, activist projects, and artist works that demonstrate how the medium of comics continues to contribute to the public understanding of HIV and AIDS through the democracy, accessibility, and immediacy of comics as a medium. So, and although the 40th anniversary of AIDS is kind of a fallacy, comics have been used since the early 1980s by artists and advocates to respond to the AIDS pandemic. Comics are a visual and accessible medium. They can take a variety of forms, and they're often employed to democratize information, to engage broad audiences, and to represent communities erased by public health narratives. And this is very much true in relation to HIV and AIDS. This means they can appeal to people of various abilities and disabilities, low literacy levels, across languages, etc. So the intention was to to demonstrate the breadth of what comics can do. The exhibition's title, Comic Velocity, comes from the writing of academic Ramsey Fawaz, who uses the term velocity when writing about the emotional intensity in comics. He specifically refers to 7 miles a second, the memoir 7 miles a second from 1996, which is drawn by James Romberger and coloured by Marguerite Van Cook, who will be speaking a bit later. Fawaz writes about how their depictions of David Vonorovich's urgent writing moves, how it moves, and the details. And the variations in emotional intensity depicted, which kind of oscillate between kind of more mundane or prosaic details and double-page spreads of exploding bodies and crushing buildings. The exhibition represents a broad spectrum of styles and approaches to comics. So, for example, next to some of the 7 miles a second panels, we have a more traditional and very regularly structured strip by Gilbert Hernandez, which was used for educational outreach by an organization called Clean Needles Now. And then nearby that, we have a vitrine which has copies of Newsline magazine in, which display strips by Michael Slocum called Xander Alexander PWA. These are loosely structured with floating images and floating panels, and depict quite light-hearted anecdotes of Michael Slocum's life as an African-American gay man living with HIV in New York. So the context is important. So, for example, that's why we displayed them in the magazines themselves. So, because, for example, Newsline, the Michael Slocum strips were published in, were set up by the People with AIDS Coalition, and so specifically by and for people with AIDS. The exhibition features work by creators Alison Bechtel, Remy Boydell with Michelle Perez, Howard Cruz, Jennifer Camper, Kate Charlesworth, Chris Komparnik, John Eichenberg, Gilbert Hernandez, Bruce Rapp, James Romberger, Marguerite Van Cook, and David Vonorovic, Carlos Sanchez Becerra, David Shenton, Michael Slocum, Beowulf Thorne, and Robert Walker, and many, many, many others. It also includes a selection of items from the UK HIV/AIDS Graphic Communication Archive, which Sean Cook will tell you a bit more about later. And as part of the exhibition, we commissioned 4 new projects that explore contemporary issues and experiences surrounding HIV/AIDS, such as HIV criminalization, women's anti-stigma activism, and the fear of getting tested. These were launched online in summer 2020, because the exhibition was due to open last year and obviously was delayed because of COVID. But you can see the comics online at visualaids.org/comics, which we'll put in the chat and a link to in the chat. But they're also available in the exhibition as free small format printed takeaways, mirroring modes of distribution previously used by other organizations. And these new comics are by J. Amaro and A. Andrews, Inez Izquierda and Cleo Sadie, Carlo Quispe and Mel Rachu. And I see that Mel is here tonight. So although she's not speaking, it's really nice to have her here. And we're also finishing up a publication to accompany the exhibition, which will include new writing by comic scholar Margaret Galvin, interdisciplinary artist Alexandre Sagade. We're reprinting an essay, a 1991 essay by comics creator and publisher Leonard Rifus, and of course, loads of comics. And you can pre-order the publication online from the VISUAL AIDS website. So this evening we've gathered some people who are kind of highlights, some people whose work is highlighted in the exhibition to speak about their experiences. So I'm super excited to hear what everybody has to say. So I think we can just go ahead, and I think we're starting with Kate Charlesworth.
Hello, good evening. Thanks, Paul and Kyle, for facilitating this event. And I'm really honoured and thrilled to be part of the show. I just wish I could be there to see it. Well, this cartoon, this strip, Life, the Universe and Almost Everything. It appeared in Britain's New Scientist magazine for over 12 years, and its regular characters were a brainy chicken and a dim cat. It was a sort of fascinating facts series in which I was given the astonishing freedom to do whatever I liked, as long as there was a sciencey connection. New Scientist coverage of HIV/AIDS research and its general reporting of the subject was excellent, but necessarily fragmented. So I decided to collect the story so far as a brief history in a series of 3 weekly episodes, which are all 3 of which the artwork is in the gallery. There's AIDS, the HIV virus, and combating the virus. I thought a month's worth might be pushing it a bit. I'm in no way a scientist, but the science was as accurate in 1991 when these strips appeared as I knew it to be, because the magazine always had wonderful fact checkers, and the folk who helped on these pages were enthusiastic and painstaking. But alongside the science, I particularly wanted to reference the myths around HIV/AIDS. You can catch it from doorknobs, the social prejudice, the homophobia, and the day-to-day reality of living with the virus. And the magazine had a huge circulation, so this strip was seen by thousands here and in America too, actually. It was the go-to science journal, and this comic was a popular feature, and kids really liked it too, so it's a double winner. And these 3 particular episodes are actually, in a way, a day job, alternative job crossover, because when I began as a cartoonist and illustrator in the early 70s, from the start I had parallel work lives. Excuse me. I had the day job, and I had its queer twin, the alt job. In the day job, I drew mainly for magazines and books, advertising, all sorts. In the alternative job, my work mostly appeared in the British gay press, and there was a lot of it, the press at the time. And this is where my friend David and I were 2 of a handful of queer cartoonists who were accidentally documenting LGBTQ+ history as it was happening. And this was probably never more important during the HIV/AIDS crisis. And a few years later, in 1988, when the fight against the Thatcher government's homophobic Section 28 began, when the so-called stigma of AIDS was opportunistically used to whip up even more hysteria against our communities. So, like Life, the Universe and Almost Everything, this next strip, Doing It With a Dam, was another anthropomorphic info comic, but this time it was absolutely from Planet Queer. It was commissioned as part of Lesbian and Gay Switch Shop's Safer Sex campaign, Lesbians, HIV and Safer Sex, Low Risk Isn't No Risk. It was an instruction leaflet for a free safer sex kit, and it was published in the same year as those 3 strips, 1991. And I can't remember whether the decision to anthropomorphize was mine or theirs, but cats and lesbians. It seemed the obvious thing. Take a dental dam from the packet. It's quite strong, shouldn't tear, but be careful with rings, fingernails, claws, etc. And it also avoided issues like body image, ethnicity, and ageism, and it fast-tracked the message. And being from the 1950s and the north of England, it was a personal relief for me not to be drawing up too close and personal in public on the principle that one way or another, we all draw ourselves. I suppose some might object to cats. I'm a dog lover, but paradoxically, I always tended to draw cats. They're more authentic deliverers of irony and sarcasm. But cats in little black 501s and leather hats and docks, what's not to like? So if it's funny, people read on and hopefully remember. That's the theory anyway, sugaring the pill. Thank you.
Hello again, I'm David and I'm honoured to be part of such a wonderful exhibition. Thank you so much for asking me. I'm going to talk about and around 3 cartoons of mine that don't actually appear in this exhibition, however, but I think they are important narratives parallel to the story being told here. A little bit of background: I was a school teacher here in the UK, yet somehow accidentally started cartooning for the British gay press in 1978. Kate was already there. Each week for 5 years, I drew single frame comments and silly joke comic strips about all things gay. Life was relatively easy. The only thing we had to fight against was the usual bigotry, coming mostly from a certain Clean Up TV campaigner who actually managed to close down gay news using a blasphemy law from 1697. Then we got to hear about the gay cancer that was happening in America. It didn't have a name yet, just a number, like a robot in Star Wars, HTLV3. And people started to get ill over here. I knew then that prejudices were going to rocket. The bigots got really serious and my cartooning had to grow up or I had to get out. The gay men, intravenous drug users and sex workers who contracted the virus were held to blame and were labelled victims. And it was 1987 when Princess Diana visited a hospital, took her glove off, and actually shook hands with one of these so-called victims. And this one small act of kindness destigmatized the nation's attitude to AIDS, and the victims became AIDS patients from that moment on. I had 3 close friends who died of AIDS, and this is my first cartoon honoring their memory. It's entitled Friends Requests. Here's Martin Ottaway, who died in 1986. Martin just wanted some mushy peas and mint sauce from Norwich Market. Nicholas Green, 1989, and Nicholas just wanted a bit of luxury, so we watched Babette's Feast on the telly. And Jim Riley, 1992. Jim just wanted some fresh air, so we found our way onto the hospice roof. The great moral cleanup continued, however. We had an AIDS-denying Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. And so gay pubs and clubs were getting raided by police wearing rubber gloves. There's a drawing of one of these in my show. Bookshops too were being swooped on, and magazines were confiscated, deemed to be pornographic, but in fact contained valuable information about HIV/AIDS and safer sex. And ultimately in 1988, Kate's already mentioned this, the government introduced an anti-gay law called Section 28, which bans schools from the promotion of homosexuality and the acceptance of gay pretend families, seriously hampering the necessary education about the virus at a time when it was needed the most. Here is my cartoon on this. It's entitled Section Education. Until the Stonewall lot get their hands on Section 28, sex education at this school will continue to be based on the reproductive cycle of the tapeworm. It has a set of male and female organs in each of its 50 to 200 proglottids and spends its life copulating in all its sections with itself. Both heterosexual and monogamous, it's a model to us all. The iniquitous Section 28, however, galvanized and consolidated our community. Gay women and men looking after their sick friends, setting up helplines, organizing food banks and kitchens, distributing condoms, lesbians abseiling into Parliament and invading the BBC. We were a pink army. It was so terrific. My third cartoon tells you we are nowhere near finished fighting and campaigning. The AIDS crisis might be over as such, but bigotry and violence against women, trans and gays is still very much with us. We all need to learn to recognize it and stand together like we did in the 80s and 90s. The baton of activism is lost. Hang on, what's this? Love to you all. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sian. I'm not a creator of comics, so thank you for including me this evening. But I am a graphic designer and an educator, and I've been involved with voluntary HIV/AIDS organisations since the 80s. Next slide. I also have a collection of UK HIV/AIDS graphic ephemera, which is available to view online. Whilst my archive contains all kinds of materials from condom packaging to posters, official government campaigns to activist flyers, it also includes items that employ comic formats, aesthetics and tropes to communicate about AIDS. So I'm going to give you a very swift tour of a few examples of how comics were used in HIV health education in the UK. Next slide. Some official health promoters used recognisable comic book graphic styles as a way of making potentially sensitive information more attractive and less controversial for a young audience. However, some grassroots organisations also adopted the superhero, pop art, comic tropes to signal empowerment and strength in the face of adversity, such as the black and white press ad from Gay Men Fighting AIDS, you can see bottom right. Next slide. When it came to health guidance, what was needed was simple, clear and informative communication. And this is an area that the deaf community had already excelled in, prioritising visual content over text. As we can see from the comic produced for deaf young people on the left, and the seamless way in which instructions for condom use are incorporated into the comic strip narrative on the right for deaf gay men. Next slide. But if you were entering a Scottish prison in the early 90s, most likely with a low level of literacy, clear communication was not what you were initially presented with. Next slide. So it was often left up to enterprising prison social workers to translate and find ways of representing this potentially life-saving information. The solution often came in the form of a highly visual comic style narrative like these, which were created in collaboration with the prisoners themselves. These included familiar prison scenarios, references to local landmarks, and use local vernacular and dialect. Next slide. I have a variety of examples from throughout the 80s and 90s that attempt to engage young people or those with low literacy levels through the use of graphic narratives. The styles and quality of the drawings vary enormously. Some are obviously produced on tight budgets, but some also had the opportunity to harness the talents of local artists. There seem to be two approaches to these types of printed matter. Either the comic is just a vehicle for a highly unlikely conversation between characters explaining HIV to each other against a variety of random backdrops and mise-en-scène. Or the theme of HIV/AIDS is carefully woven into a story that attempts to create a real-life scenario for the audience to identify with. Next slide. Another tried and tested narrative approach was the photo story, especially used in publications aimed at teenage girls. This structure was then also adopted by the Terence Higgins Trust in 1991, when it produced the first in a series of pocket-sized photo stories for gay men. And this format remained popular, getting even more explicit with the full-sized 2005 magazine spread. These demonstrated that health information could be successfully smuggled in with narrative content that the audience wanted and responded to. Next slide. And nowhere was that more successful than in a series of comics and associated leaflets published by the Manchester-based drugs charity Lifeline. From 1985 onwards, they commissioned graphic artist Michael Linnell to produce a range of materials. Linnell had the unlikely combination of a degree in fine art and a master's in health education, but more importantly, a creative talent for communicating practical information with humour and an authentic subversive voice in a way that resonated with the intended audience. He also has a comprehensive online archive of his work, and it's well worth checking out at michaellinnell.org.uk, and I'll put the address in the chat as well. Thank you.
Hello to everyone at the Visual AIDS Art Gallery slash, I don't know, I guess it's a gallery, I guess it's a gathering, all of that good stuff. Well, just as a little aside about the segment that you'll be looking at, it's drawn by Remy Boydell initially, and then watercolored by them afterwards. Remy works in watercolors. It's very beautiful stuff. It is a retelling of an instance when I was doing sex work in Washington State, and it's one segment of many in our comic book, The Pervert. The Pervert is kind of a semi-autobio tale. I say semi-autobio not in the sense that I like, it's a good way to articulate this. You know, there's the standard definition where semi-autobio, someone else is also helping, etc. Whereas this is like, it's kind of a composite, I guess, of real life events slash, you know, fiction. You aren't going to tell a one-to-one with reality because one, it's going to be very boring, and you know, your job is to kind of talk about real life experience while also making it work within the medium you're in. So it's for comics. So this was sort of a breakdown of a situation I had where, yeah, had unprotected sex with a client, and, you know, came inside, so obviously you're going to get checked out. And very fast, didn't cost anything, found out we were fine. And I mean, you know, obviously there's a lot of stigma with getting a positive result, and obviously I think staying informed and making conscious health decisions for the betterment of your life, while also, you know, be conscious of yourself and the community you're within, is good. And, you know, just being a person in the world and being considerate, and also just, you know, or let's say you get a positive result, well, it's no longer the death sentence it was in the past. It is a lot different now. It's super costly. Hopefully that changes in the future. And there are also good developments now, like they're because of COVID and the mRNA vaccine, they've basically been able to work on an mRNA HIV AIDS vaccine. Means within our lifetime, that could mean the eradication of it outright, which I think is wonderful. And that's, you know, something I you know, hopefully it works out. But yeah, this was just sort of a brief aside. It's kind of a body of many things where, yeah, there's a lot of risk-reward decisions someone makes in life, but at the end of the day, yeah, you're a person that lives in the world with other people, and yeah, it's worth, you know, using protection. It's worth using PrEP if you have access to it, if you have access to any of this stuff, and being, you know, considerate and conscientious, speaking to your partners, notifying them of status. A lot of people get tested together. That shit's pretty sick. I mean, it's not like hella romantic. I wouldn't be like, yeah, let's do this before a date. Like, that sounds like a hostage situation. Do not do that. But yeah, absolutely. I hope you enjoy the gallery. Hope you enjoy hearing briefly from all of the other speakers. I am really happy to participate in this with Visual AIDS. And yeah, have a good time, y'all. Take it easy. And yeah, look at explicit penetration in a comic book scene before it is likely made illegal by gay people. That's right. Tim Cook is gay, and he censors gay shit so often. That's so weird. Anyway, have a nice life.
Hello. Thank you for everyone who put this gallery exhibit together. It's an amazing collection. I was lucky enough to get a chance to see it, and I hope everybody who's in New York can see it as well. It's thrilling to see so much great cartoon art, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. I was doing the cartoons. We can go to the next slide. I was doing these cartoons in the 80s and 90s. They were being published in the gay press, the queer and feminist newspapers in the United States and Canada. During that time, almost every major city had some kind of gay or lesbian or feminist or underground publication that would print this kind of work. And during the AIDS crisis, we were in this peculiar situation where we were engulfed in grief and anger, and yet the government and the healthcare system was ignoring what was happening. And if you were queer, this was a big part of your life, especially if you lived in a major urban center. And yet I remember hearing from straight people saying things like, I don't know anybody who has AIDS. And I was dumbfounded that that would be such a huge divide between people who were living through this crisis and those who were totally untouched. And as a result, we had to bring our own information to our community. And I think the gay press was a big part of that, and the gay activists and queers of all kinds who were trying really hard to get information to our community about healthcare, about the laws, and about how to take care of each other. And so I was drawing cartoons about that experience. And so much of what has happened in healthcare today that we're seeing, particularly with COVID, I think is a direct outshoot of what we were doing during AIDS. And yes, bearing angry witness in this cartoon, that's really, you know, we were all taking care of each other. We were all trying to figure stuff out. And we were going through this horrific experience together, and yet we were completely ignored by the mainstream. We can go to the next slide. And there was a lot of blaming. There were guilty and innocent victims, you know, like if you were queer, or if you were IV drug user, or if you were a sex worker, somehow you brought it on yourself. But if you were, you know, a kid who got a blood transfusion and got HIV/AIDS, then you were an innocent victim. And the language around AIDS was being determined by the mainstream media, not by the queer community. And so that was another place where we were always fighting to change the discourse. And we can go to the next slide. And this is just a fun cartoon I did with, the gay pride parade, lesbians who like to fuck in the back seats of big American cars with V8 engines and leather interiors, all those contingency groups. But there was people with AIDS who don't think that AIDS has brought them a more serene approach to life. God damn it. There was a whole period where there were people, sort of new agey people, who were doing this sort of, I don't know, trying to convince people that being sick was somehow bringing them enlightenment. And I was really angry at that. Many of us were angry at that. So I feel that these comics and the work that all of us were doing were really important to speak to our own community in a way that was really important, because we weren't getting this information anywhere else. We were the ones who had to figure out how to take care of each other and how to get access to the healthcare that we all needed. And a big part of that was, definitely activist organizations, but also just people in very small ways who were taking care of each other, bringing people food, trying to find housing, and burying each other when their own families wouldn't do that. So these comics are really a huge testament to the courage and the bravery and the activism that we all went through at that time, and that helped us to survive. And thank you for including me in this really powerful exhibit.
Hello, my name is Carlos Luis Sanchez Becerra. I am an artist from Venezuela. From 2016 to 2018, there were no medication or tests for HIV patients here. So I made a lot of artworks to protest. From these times, I made a portrait of Simón Bolívar dying from AIDS. Simón Bolívar is our national hero. Also a portrait of Francisco de Miranda dying from AIDS, and even a music video about Santa Claus dying from AIDS. In the song, I say that he won't be able to come to Venezuela because there are no medication here. At the end of the video, he got well because he got his medication. Santa Claus has got the AIDS this year. For me, it was very much like, it's nice to make something about that thing. In the song, I say something like, he won't be able to come to Venezuela because here there's no medication, but maybe next year. For this exhibition, I made a comic about my own personal story with HIV/AIDS. How I got it, how I got better, how we had some very scary times here by not being able to get our medication, how we have to travel to Colombia to find it. A lot of friends died from the AIDS, and many of them thought it was a myth that they could get better by taking ayahuasca or something like that. Sadly, it was not like that. So many others just couldn't get their medication. And all the people I tell you who died from AIDS, their family didn't say that. They said lies. HIV/AIDS here in Venezuela is very much still something people get very much afraid. My work is inspired by folk, Venezuelan folk, but mixed with some queerness. I made only paintings from 2004 to 2013. Then I saw a Robert Crumb's book, and I said to myself, well, this is a great way to show stories that I can't really tell by painting. So I started to make these self-biographical comics. The color in my comics is inspired by the light of the Caribbean, which is very much strong. We don't have winter. Here is all year very much shiny. I also make a lot of works about being queer or about the perception of queerness here in Venezuela. I treat some very macho stereotypes in a queer way. There's a stereotype here about the thief, and I made a queer version of thieves, and people really like that. It's a queer character who is a thief. I mean, thieves usually are macho man, didn't they? They are like some very strong dudes with some gun and they're gonna shoot you and kill you and da 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 da. So I made a queer character who is like, I will suck your dick or I'll kill you. And people think that's funny, but I think it's breaks the stereotypes in a way that it's not like trying to be activist, but in a way that really gets to all people. I think in their subconscious, I could make a change by making this kind of art. I hope so. I think people laugh about that, but by doing that, I'm changing the way they see these stereotypes, the way they see queer people, and the way they see macho people. This through laughter. I made a queer version of Adam and Eve. It's Adam and Steve. And this queer version has aliens and monkeys. And people really like that through internet. I'm very glad about this kind of queer works. Goodbye.
All right, we're situating 7 miles a second in terms of comics at the time. In 1986, when we started it, David had just finished doing his second show with us, and he basically went, we set up this 3-part structure, which was him as a kid, as a rent boy on Times Square, and then the second part was him as a teenager, and the third part was him as an adult. But within that, and Marguerite suggested this, is that it was a kind of a 3-part thing about his own diagnosis was present in this book, because the first part, and I drew a lot of that when I was in Belgium. We were staying there for like half a year. He hadn't gotten diagnosed yet. I remember when I first had meetings with him, he'd had like several tests, like one was positive and another one would be negative and another one positive. And so he just didn't really know. He knew that a lot of people in his circle had passed away. So it wasn't looking good with the way he put it to me. And then the second part, I started drawing when we came back, and he had sent us a postcard, like a little envelope full of these various clippings. One of them was like him at a AIDS demonstration in Washington. He's holding this tombstone, and there's a little arrow drawn on the newspaper photograph that says "me," So he had been diagnosed, and I managed it. Like the first 2 parts, we did quite closely together, but then there was like a long break when just so many things came up that he was involved in. He was starting to get sick, so we only really able to meet a few times about the third part. So I kind of incorporate, basically that part. So you have pre-diagnosis, diagnosis section in the second, third one posthumous because he died. You had to finish it without him. So, like for instance, this spread that you're seeing.
So when we were thinking about what to present today, and I think it's really interesting, we've already heard somebody talking about anger, and I think that's a theme that came through. Rather than talking about what we usually talk about, we decided we would work on 3 different aspects of David's anger. And in this particular sequence, he's puts his hand into the television because he's angry at the media and the way that people with AIDS are being represented. James,
well, this is a pretty difficult part because all the way up to this point, I was doing these pretty straightforward cinematic comic-y, like moment after moment scenes. In this case, you know, he would do these, what we call them rants, because he would just go off and he would have this long diatribe, which he was very directed towards different people in the establishment at that time. But in this case, I didn't want to like chop it up into little panels or anything. So I just ran it full, and then almost, this is really specifically almost like an illustration job. So you have, you know, have him laying on his bed, and actually in his room next to his bed, he had a baby elephant skeleton. This thing was huge. It was in his room. He's watching his TV. He's got like a McDonald's Big Mac box because he would eat this crap. At the same time, he's taking whatever hideous drugs that he had to take. So you have like him laying there, and then you have this very sci-fi idea of him reaching into the TV and electrifying it. And then the third part is almost like an EC Comics drawing, but it's a drawing basically. At one point, David did an installation. I mean, he did installations. He did one at our gallery. He had several skeletons, full-size skeletons, and he would do installations with them. Well, he did one installation. It was anonymous. It was called the Lazaretto at GPOW. But I knew immediately walking in, it was David's work, and he made one room in this thing like a hospital room with a corpse in the bed, you know, with the pills next to him. So I you know, it was a logical jump to drawing a rotting sort of EC corpse, which is kind of based on, you know, the Haitian voodoo, you know, rotting corpses, Walking Dead, all this stuff comes from the idea that the slave Haitians that rebelled against their masters are, oh no, actually they're enslaving themselves. I mean, this is the kind of story that the establishment likes to construct about all things like, oh, AIDS, they did it to themselves. So it's not that far away.
I mean, this is possibly one of the pages that's the most referential to comics.
Right.
It's self-referential to comics. We have David's arm extending out with the sound effects, and you know, the EC Comics reference.
Strangely enough, on the first page, right at the bottom, there's a line where he goes, "Oh, it's ironic when, you know, this person takes on the face of a family man who wants to protect his children because I am his child and I have AIDS, and AIDS is used as a weapon to enforce the conservative agenda." And I remember lettering those words, "I have AIDS," and thinking, "Shit, I've got AIDS." And then it's like, whatever, you know, it's cocktails all around. So can you go to the next slide?
Yeah. I mean, the point of that sequence that we selected was that it had to do with anger towards media to the world outside. This sequence, which I think is really powerful, we haven't really discussed this, is incredibly angry, but in a completely different way.
Well, I mean,
there's a really powerful line in
there's
here.
a whole thing. It's like you have him like the classic American, you know, driving out on the highway, which I know there's a book that Marion S. did about driving out with him. He liked to do these road trips anyway, so I drew him specifically like that. And then he's thinking about his father, and like one time his father was going to beat him as he usually did, and said, "Oh, well, what should I do?" And David goes, "Oh, well, don't beat me." And so he's like, "Oh, okay." You know, and then he's looking at this father with the kid, and the guy's smoking. He doesn't really give a shit about the kid who's trying to play. And David just goes, "I wondered what he'd say if I knew I wanted his hard hetero dick pumping in and out of my mouth." I was like, for me, I like really deliberately selected that bit of writing because I was like, this was a big slap in the face to the, you know, a paternalistic comics tradition, let's just say. So, I mean, it really was an aggressive thing. And Marguerite did incredible violence to the color there. So that's really,
yeah, I mean, this is one of the places I went to town on letting things bleed out. You know, so his own infection, you know, his own anger is just bleeding out onto this page. Nothing's contained, you know, and yet it's this a very Americana landscape that everything's upside down.
So you can go do the next slide, and really, this is one of the next slide. Oh, this is one of the pieces that's actually in the show, and a lot of people relate to this, and it was kind of like what David had said, "Oh, draw me huge on Fifth Avenue smashing buildings." Well, at the time when I did it, like after his death, but he had done a demo at St. Pat's, so it was really not much of a leap to have him smashing St. Pat's. And then Marguerite really intuitively put the rainbow there.
That was very
colors
weird.
On that sucker.
I just thought somewhere in the book we need this, and this was the moment to do it. And you know, and of course, one of the things that makes this so salient is how angry we were at the Catholic Church and the way the Catholic Church behaved all the way through this.
They were being dick.
And how they had treated David personally. I mean, it was just horrendous that, you know, the place that people wanted to go to for comfort was just no condoms. They were actively running interference with
things worse.
everything. They were making things worse. So I was, for one, very happy to see an image of St. Pat's being completely smashed.
There you go.
And then, just as by a sidebar, we made stickers of this particular image because across the road in what was it, Bergdorf
It's like
Goodwin,
Bergdorf.
they did like a kind of Happy Bunny version of David, and some
And they had a
kind of
window display.
a
in
window
Bergdorf,
display.
David, yeah.
And so we went and put this all over the
Stickered it right all through
windows. Yeah,
the front.
like no, that won't work.
David would have just broke the windows. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. But thank you very much for having us in this. And you guys have all provided such lucid information. And this work was so personal because David died while we were, involved with making it. And we were watching him die. So I think we're a little less objective.
Then we're all very diminished.
Thank you.
Okay, but first of all, I want to thank Paul and Kyle for having me in the exhibit of Visual AIDS. It's such an honor. And I give a little background. I worked in comics for many years, and I started working with an independent company called AC Comics. And then I came to New York with a dream, and somehow I worked for Marvel as an illustrator and worked through other mainstream comics book industry, not industries, but comic book companies as well. But which leads to the way of how I came to create my own comic book company. It was just called Digital Noise. I was sort of like an illustrator, but I wouldn't go by the guidelines of the storytelling from the writer, because I would create my own scenario with the illustrations. So, I felt more of a calling to become a storyteller of comics. And that's how I came to create the Positive Omen. Which slide are we on right now? But anyway.
This is just the first one.
Oh, just the first one. Okay, well, we can go to the next slide, please.
Got it.
Okay, so this is the Positive Omen, and the Positive Omen I created in 2004, and they were sort of like an introduction in my other title comic book called Delete. And the Positive Omen is a superhero group where all the members are HIV and AIDS positive, and they gain their superpowers from a failed antidote of curing AIDS, and it was like a world testing of it, and but somehow this testing gave the few of the people that weren't deathly affected by this failed cure, they gained these powers, but they still were HIV or AIDS positive. And so I created this team because when I create something, I have to create something with meaning and something that feels strongly to me. And unbeknownst to me, I was an activist, or I am an activist. I have an activist spirit. And I've always been for the fight against HIV, for HIV and AIDS awareness. Because when I was younger, I had a family member that died of AIDS. And I didn't understand it. My family wouldn't talk about it that much. And I didn't know how this family member died, and really didn't understand because they would talk around in corners about it. And so until I came to New York and I started to know a lot of people that had HIV and AIDS with the groups in New York that I hung out with. And then also I lived in Harlem during that time in 2004, as I was getting tested for the virus, and, because I was sexually active, or I am, I'm a sexually active person, I get checked out. And so what I found out from getting these tests, that a lot of young people were getting infected. And I was actually seeing this happen. like kids from 14 and even younger. And so, and within the Black and Hispanic community, it was really growing because, there's this dogma, before then that AIDS is, or HIV is a gay cancer or a gay curse. And, but a lot of people weren't well informed. They thought, as being straight, or if you're not gay, you won't get it, even if you have unprotected sex. So I felt the need to create a comic book that would focus on that and strictly focus on it, not talk around about it, not create a fake disease that would be a metaphor about AIDS or anything like that. So I wanted directly to talk about HIV and AIDS, and also that opened the door to the Positive O+MEN. And the Positive O+MEN, I created a super team, is because I want to show all walks of life that are affected by HIV and AIDS. I mean, all you have to do is have unprotected sex with the right person, not the right person or the wrong person, however you want to see it. And you don't take safety and precautions and be responsible with sex, you could catch the virus as well. And also, I didn't want to demonize people who have HIV and AIDS and at the same time. So it was just more of an educational thing as well as an entertainment vehicle back then in the modern medium that everybody loved comic books. And so the members consist of straight, gay. I had created characters that had different sexualities that we even named today. Back then, there wasn't a name for it, like non-binary. I have a character called Memory that I created in 2004, and she didn't have any identity as a boy or girl. She just lived her life, and she lived her life as a person. And whoever she has sex with or whoever she has relationship with, and she didn't identify with a sexual title or her sexual identity, being a man or a woman. And this was before the word non-binary came out. And so I just want to show that part of in my comic book, the side of sexuality, because if you're talking about HIV and AIDS, one of the strong major points is that you have to talk about sex. So the comic book deals with different characters showing different sexualities and what they identify with. And I created this for HIV and AIDS awareness, and with the I'm trying to figure out which ones we can go to that we see with the lead character. His name is Nightcry. He's gay. He has a lover. His name is Javon. We have Hot, which is a character. Her name is Christina Lopez, and she has the power of fire. And we have Chaos. He's a superstar football player that was on the DL, and he's discovering his sexuality, that he likes men. So you don't know whether he's gay or bisexual. And of course, we already talked about Memory. We also have Goth. Memory has the power of affecting time. And Goth, he has the ability to never die, and whatever kills him, he'll have that power of the instrument or whatever that killed him, and he can use that power against his foe. And he's straight. We have Precious. We won't identify her sexuality yet because it's something you'll discover in the future. And we have Slumber, Agony, and Eros, which they're all straight, and they have different powers and things like that. So I just want to show all different walks of life, levels of life, all different races, all different backgrounds that are affected by HIV and AIDS. And even now, oh, and they came out with their first actual own title in 2009, and I called it The Negative Issue. And that kind of gave you the introduction of who the positive O+MEN were. And I also came out with the issue called The Positive Issue after the Negative Issue. And now I'm going to do now is, in the future now, I'm going to create a graphic novel that will explain the stories of the positive O+MEN, and also which will come out into another book, which will be a new title called Red Alert. That's coming out from that, because I wanted to talk about not only HIV and AIDS, but I also want to talk about different viruses, especially with the coronavirus. I don't know if we should say that now, but the COVID-19. And I'm creating a book about that deals with different viruses or different illnesses that are chronic and can't be cured as well. So that's what my comic book, The Positive O+MEN, is about. And again, I want to thank you all for having me, and good.